is going to speak on cultural Marxism for the right. Tana has a couple of books due to appear, one on contemporary entertainment industry. So I think we're actually going to see some things.
Yeah, I've got a few slides prepared, but we're not pretty excited about the exemplary of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to talk about cultural Marxism or the cultural left from the vantage point of cultural Marxists or the left, but rather what I want to talk about today is how the new right has rewritten the history of the cultural left and cultural Marxists on behalf of present-day hegemonic exigencies. So I'm going to be basically discussing how the web has become a site upon which new right activists produce and circulate negative, propagandistic, conspiratorial discourse on the history, identity, influence, and present-day effects of cultural Marxism in the US and around the world. So I'll just give you a few examples of some of these instances where right-wing activists use the web to circulate negative discourse on cultural Marxism. So on Facebook, a stock cultural Marxism group page claims that, quote, in Western Europe and the United States, the Marxist economic model has never been applied. However, cultural Marxism dominates all aspects of our society. We live in a society of Marxist ideology. Yeah, if only Hegemony was so easy, of course. On MySpace, John's blog entry entitled Cultural Marxism and the Decline of Western Civilization links to Stormfront.org, of course, a white supremacist hate group website. In Yahoo Answers, exclamation point, conveys 126 questions about cultural Marxism. Yahoo Answers, of course, is a user-generated question-answer forum where people post questions and other people answer them. And it's sort of this interesting knowledge community formation. But Destroy Zone number 5 asks, has cultural Marxism become the dominant ideology in the West today? The Punisher of TNB asks, what do you think about cultural Marxism? Will it destroy America? Twitter, Reed Conqueror, True Pain, Adams Baldwin use 140-character tweets to report the rise of a cultural Marxist power elite in the United States, riffing on C. Wright Mills's old hypothesis, perhaps, but of course radically transforming it to present a new class enemy, which is, of course, the cultural Marxists. YouTube archives more than 1,350 videos about cultural Marxism. They include Nazi Rubber Duck explains cultural Marxism. And here, this video basically is by a white supremacist that talks about racial eugenics and why the cultural Marxists problematize racism and therefore are enemies of the people and this kind of thing. The history of Marxist infiltration and subversion of culture is another interesting video. Death of the West, Frankfurt School, Cultural Marxism, Political Correctness, The Terror of Cultural Marxism, and 50 Years of Cultural Marxist Poison. There's many videos to observe. You see just Google searches as well. A May 9th, 2012 Google search for cultural Marxism returned 543 million links. Many that do not take us to actual Marxist websites or socialist organizations, but rather to radical conservative right-wing websites and organizations as well. So this is sort of a really interesting phenomenon I'm observing, whereby the right, in some respects, is trying to capture this terrain of the meaning of cultural Marxism, reformulate it, and then essentially obliterate it on behalf of their own political project. So what does cultural Marxism mean to right-wing activists? What are the primary sources, the institutional sources of right-wing web discourse on cultural Marxism? What claims and statements do right-wing authors make about the historical origins, identity, goals, contemporary influence, and impact of cultural Marxism in the US and the world? What are the hegemonic uses of this discourse, and what ideological contradictions does this discourse attempt to resolve? If we can think about ideology as a kind of problem-solving device or a magical resolution to crises or contradictions that are sort of threatening to tear the sort of cultural infrastructure apart, what kind of hegemonic work does this discourse do? What problems does it attempt to resolve? And how might it actually connect and resonate with working people? I mean, that's another question, of course, if you want to talk about hegemony. How does this discourse actually interpolate or mobilize people toward a right-wing politic? And what perhaps can we learn from this process as well? So in this paper, I'm going to argue that right-wing intellectuals struggle for hegemony in the space of the web through the production and circulation of a propagandistic discourse on cultural Marxism. This conservative discourse on cultural Marxism is a real force of capitalist cultural hegemony in the actual and virtual world. So my argument's guided methodologically or conceptually by the neo-Marxist method developed by Stuart Hall and others at the University of Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the late 1970s and 80s. Following Gramsci, Hall analyzed how specific political blocs, coalitions of class interests, struggle for leadership or hegemony over civil society through a war of position and the state through a war of maneuver, using instruments of coercion and persuasion. Hall emphasized how ideas or ideology is significant means of persuasion in social class struggles for hegemony. Hall encouraged Marxists at the time to complicate abstract, generalized, and economistic accounts of ideology that either linked it simply to false consciousness or the distortions of commodity fetishism, and do historicist-specific conjunctional analysis of how political blocs articulate ideologies, then mobilize people to their program. Hall emphasized also how intellectuals participate in struggles for hegemony by producing and distributing ideas that intend to cultivate consent to the bloc they represent. So this battle of ideas was waged through civil society's many private cultural apparatuses, as Gramsci called them, and Thomas calls them hegemonic apparatuses. So we can talk about schools, churches, the media, popular culture, and in this paper, of course, the web as a hegemonic cultural apparatus, or a private, now also private-public cultural apparatus. Also, I'm taking sort of note from Hall's work with the Russian linguistic philosopher Valentin Voloshinov, who talks about the materiality of science in class struggle. He wants to look at how words, concepts, phrases, symbols get attached to different class positions and represented in struggles for hegemony. So cultural Marxism may be obvious, of course, to Marxists, or cultural studies Marxism, or the cultural contributions of Marxists may be obvious to Marxists. We have a sense of what it is, what it means, how it functions. But this is itself a train of struggle. It's a train of class struggle. The meaning of cultural Marxism in society is a train of class struggle that various factions and blocs are fighting over. And in the case of this particular paper, we see how the right essentially tries to appropriate or co-opt the meaning of cultural Marxism to demonize cultural Marxists, socialists, anarchists, and everybody else that would consider themselves part of a progressive struggle for change. So I take the concept of cultural Marxism to be a small, but nevertheless important site of class struggle over the meaning of Marxism and its many connotations in society. Cultural Marxism, a political badge and critical orientation, many on the left, including myself, have worn with pride, has been turned into an instrument of right-wing hegemony. Actually, an interesting instrument or experience teaching one time when a student kind of labeled me as a cultural Marxist. And I'm like, well, yeah, I'm doing Marxist cultural studies. But that was like really a term of opprobrium. That was like a real concern for the student because of all this baggage that's now been attached to cultural Marxism due to the right-wing sort of framing of it. So I want to analyze how intellectuals based in a variety of conservative hegemonic apparatuses use the World Wide Web to produce and circulate a negative discourse on cultural Marxism. In their struggle for leadership, right-wing intellectuals represent cultural Marxism in partial and selective ways to influence and shape how people may perceive cultural Marxism and its politics in society. So they do this, of course, to delegitimize it, and of course to delegitimize the broader Marxist or socialist left, and all the positions associated with it. So where are the essential, this discourse coming from? Where is this discourse of cultural Marxists coming from? My analysis sort of brings me to right-wing think tanks. What is the concrete organizational institutional source of the discourse? Well, there's a plurality of well-funded, corporate-financed, conservative right-wing think tanks that are engaged in a war of ideas every day, of course. And they are largely responsible for this discourse on cultural Marxism. So in the early 1990s, right-wing think tanks in the US, including the Free Congress Foundation, established by Paul Weyrich, and of course, when Harper was elected for the first time, Weyrich sent a letter to Harper saying, decimate Canada's cultural Marxists, which just sort of gives you an example of that bleed between borders of this ideology. And it's Washington-based Center for Cultural Conservatism, which is run by William S. Lind. The Heritage Foundation, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Christian Coalition, and the Foundation for Cultural Review have produced a number of essays on the topic of cultural Marxism. These essays have subsequently been downloaded, copied, cut and pasted, added to, modified, recirculated by a number of right-wing websites, including Front Page magazine, run by the turncoat David Horowitz, who was once on the New Left and then became a radical opponent, of course, of the left. This is sort of a far-right guy. AmericanThinker.com, The New American, and many more. The topic of cultural Marxism is also taken up by a number of white supremacist hate groups, sort of neo-fascist organizations, including the Council of Conservative Citizens and the National Policy Institute. And chat about cultural Marxism can be found on millenarian Christian websites, such as the Virgin Mary's End Time Prophecies, and neo-Nazi websites, including Stormfront.org. So this is really circulating, you know, and we may sort of chuckle and laugh and see crazy right-wing conspiracy theories, but this is actually an ideological force in the right that can bleed over into other struggles that limit ours. So one can even order a 98-minute DVD video called Cultural Marxism. And you see famous paleo-conservatives starring in this video. Ron Paul, Pat Buchanan, Jeff Griffin. The right has its own independent film network. And this is, you know, a 98-minute video about the history of cultural Marxism and how it's destroyed and corrupted traditional essential American values. You know, so it's out there. So what do they say anyway about cultural Marxism? And I'm just going to present a brief historic gloss. Scott presents the accurate history, and this is the right-wing counter-history of, I think, cultural Marxism. But basically say that cultural Marxism is the product of course, Antonio Gramsci. After being imprisoned by Benito Mussolini, fighting fascism, prison notebooks get sort of smuggled out. And this basically lays the foundation of a new sort of, you know, cultural Marxist political strategy. Thornton claims that Gramsci liberated the Marxist project from the prison of economic dogma and outlined a Marxist strategy that promised to win the world voluntarily to Marxism. Marxist cultural hegemony, the nonviolent organization of mass consent to the communist ideal, would occur by forming strategic alliances with non-communist groups and gradually destroying America and Western civilization's core capitalist values. Gramsci encourages Marxists to gain control of the organs of culture, churches, education, newspapers, magazines, the electronic media, serious literature, music, the visual arts, and so on. The new battleground, reasoned Gramsci, must become culture, starting with the traditional family, and then completely engulfing churches, schools, media, entertainment, civic organizations, literature, science, and history. So there's kind of the war of position that Gramsci does talk about. This is how the right is essentially making sense of the cultural Marxist power elite. So Gramsci establishes, of course, this political strategy, but it is the Frankfurt School which is rendered responsible for importing it to the United States. Of course, when Adorno and Horkheimer and Reich and Fromm and so on flee the Nazi regime to the US, they set up, of course, at the Columbia University in New York City, and they're sort of rendered responsible for importing this Gramscian cultural Marxist strategy to the US. They then essentially train an entire generation of leftists that then sort of do the march to the institutions and eventually control the main apparatuses of the state. Interesting wish fulfillment, of course, for some of us. But so according to the right, critical theory is used to do deconstructive criticism of all the main elements of Western capitalist culture. Marcuse becomes the figurehead of this, of course, in the 60s, training an entire generation of Americans, essentially winning them to the Marxist strategy and converting them to communism. Morse says, here's an interesting quote from a right-wing journalist, Marcuse recruited radical youth, feminists, black militants, homosexuals, the alienated, the asocial, third world revolutionaries, all the angry voices of the persecuted victims in scare quotes, of the West to the cultural Marxist cause. And by the 21st century, these cultural Marxists have become a new US power elite. Okay, so this is where the fantasy is sort of very, very interesting, because it's not so much, yes, Marcuse had, that was the struggle, and yes, there was the Columbia University sort of Frankfurt School thing, and yes, Gramsci has the political strategy, but the interesting component of this is that this is the new power elite for the right. There's this notion that cultural Marxists essentially developed during that era have become the new power elite that rule the ideological state apparatuses, in an Althusserian sense. So cultural Marxists now purportedly use the education system to indoctrinate students with their ideology. Even worse, they subvert the modernist academy's cultivation of rational, patriotic citizen subjects that can appreciate the aesthetic merits of canonized culture. Walter Benjamin's essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, is held responsible for politicizing art and opening the door to totalitarianism. In Benjamin's essay, says Kimball, grateful academics found the perfect rationalization of their efforts to subordinate the ostensible subject of their discipline to an agenda, to reduce art or literature to a political alibi. This weak of the list's most modest causes, and so on. The Adorno-Benjamin analysis, Mendocino, represents almost the entire theoretical basis of all the politically correct aesthetic trends which now plague our universities. So that's an interesting extrapolation from one essay. Cultural Marxist control extends to the mainstream corporate media as well. On a website called Occidental Observers, White Identity, Interests, and Culture, MacDonald says, quote, "It's virtually a cliche that Hollywood is the embodiment of cultural Marxism and the exclusion of conservatives. Ownership over the means of media production allows cultural Marxists to discriminate against conservative directors, producers, and actors." And you see essentially a left critique of capitalist Hollywood being kind of converted into a right-wing fantasy of left-wing Hollywood that excludes conservatives. It's just an interesting turn. Control of this base gives them control of the superstructure, the kind of entertainment media that is watched by millions of people. The cultural industry's cultural Marxist controllers make TV shows and films that deliberately attack, bully, and ridicule conservatives and conservative ideology, they argue. Right-wing authors also claim that in addition to lording over the education system and media, cultural Marxists occupy the US federal government, the courts, and so on. They use the law and the power of the military to transform US society and the world. Lynn claims that the US government is now an ideological state that's coming to resemble Stalin's Russia, Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy. Dominating the so-called ideological state is, of course, US President Barack Obama, who is represented as a communist imperialist dictator by many right-wing websites. Tea Party activist Joseph Esfera, founder of WorldNet Daily, claims that Obama will secure election after election for cultural Marxists. The goals of cultural Marxism are primarily the destruction of Christianity and the creation of chaos. Taking notes from left-wing cultural imperialism theory, of course coined by Herbert Schiller in 1976 and taken up by many other left authors, including myself, pundits say that the US cultural Marxist elite uses the persuasive and coercive powers of the US state to dominate other nations too culturally. One quote said, Lynn says, "The United States has become the world leader of the cultural Marxist revolution." According to Lynn, quote, "Some European countries have gone further than the US in making cultural Marxism the state ideology, and America had much to do with injecting the poison of cultural Marxism into the European body politic." Interesting stuff. So here's a bunch of user-generated images. You know, we're always celebrating, you know, the user-generated potentiality of Web 2.0 and looking at what activists are doing and presenting, you know, their culture jams and all these kinds of things. Well, the right has a number of culture jammers as well, of course, and they use these tools to forward their own agenda. So Comrade Obama has well earned his place. You know, Marx, it's a socialist thing, you wouldn't understand. The Three Socialists, Lenny Curly, Obama. These are, I mean, there's hundreds of these examples. It's just like, you know, really interesting right-wing creativity and uses of digital media. Obey, sort of Stalinist, sort of social realist sort of imagery of Obama as dictator here, and so on and so forth. So what are the political uses then? So I mean, that's just basically a sense of where this comes from, who's responsible for it, how it circulates, what these authors say about cultural Marxism, but what actual uses do they make of cultural Marxism in real political struggle? Though fantastical, this right-wing discourse is an instrument of ideological persuasion in right-wing struggles for moral leadership in civil society. Right-wing intellectuals use cultural Marxism to do three things: manufacture public consent to conservative nationalism, cultivate a violent or just angry populist backlash against non-conservatives, not just socialists and Marxists, but liberals too, and perpetuate anti-Marxism to maintain public compliance with capitalism. So I read cultural Marxism in this context as an instrument of right-wing hegemony. So I'll just talk about these three uses briefly. So right-wing authors use cultural Marxism as a means for making the meaning of America in their own image. So there's sort of a struggle to define what America is and what it is not. This discourse of cultural Marxism allows conservatives to define the American national self in a specific way, distinct or different from cultural Marxist others, both internal and external to the territorial state of the US. So they construct a good conservative national self by differentiating this identity from the characteristics and values of internal and external individuals and groups they label as bad cultural Marxist others. And by doing so, they try to knit together, articulate, or interpolate a variety of individuals and groups that do not necessarily or obviously share a common ideological ground as true Americans by differentiating them from domestic and foreign non-American cultural Marxist others. So who are the bad cultural Marxist others, according to these authors? Of course, socialists, Marxists, but also feminists, liberal feminists, gay rights activists, lesbian, transgender people, people of color, pacifists, anti-war groups, vegans, show up in this discourse, liberal multiculturalists, Muslims, and sometimes Jews in the sort of white supremacist rendering of this discourse, secular humanists, revolutionary workers or unionized workers as well, non-white immigrants, social justice activists, human rights organizations, animal rights groups, and environmentalist organizations. They all get lumped into this category of the bad cultural Marxist other. So by labeling these groups as un-American cultural Marxist others, right-wing authors represent capitalist patriarchs, heterosexuals, white people, militaristic warmongers, meat-eaters, nativist nationalists, Christian theocrats, the disorganized and politically disenfranchised working poor, white immigrants, people compliant with inequality, people that don't worry much about global warming or animal rights, non-unionized workers as true Americans. So that's the block they attempt to interpolate by defining all these others as non-Americans, right? So another use is, of course, to build or incite a populist backlash against individuals and groups labeled cultural Marxists. Albertazzi and MacDonald define populism as a political strategy that pits a virtuous and homogeneous people against a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice. New right strategists are masters of populism. To organize the consent of the working class majority to their rule, they focus on divisive cultural issues, not economic inequality. And Thomas Frank has a lot of interesting work on this. So conservative cultural warriors tap into working class resentment. Oh, okay, thanks very much. With reference to the strawman liberal elite, or the strawman cultural Marxist elite. So, of course, the Marxist elite, not the 1%, becomes the class enemy. The conservatives will now mobilize people to fight against. And I've got a lot more to say. I've got a much more detailed analysis and critique of these various strategies. And then I talk a little bit more about this is conspiracy theory, but then the sort of the effectivity or the political function of this conspiracy. Why might it be popular? Why might people respond to it? Why might people be attracted to it? But the point I just want to conclude with, and we could perhaps talk about this a little bit more, is just that cultural Marxism is a multi-accentual sign. It is a trade of class struggle over meaning. And I think that the work of Stuart Hall and other Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies scholars remains very significant in understanding the new right today so that we can essentially fight it. And I'll conclude there.
Thank you. Can we come back up? So it's